Welcome to Hanshaw's Horizon Podcast, where we explore learning science and all the tools you need to create a high-performance learning environment, whether it's in higher education or industry. Today we're going to explore distributed practice, or the spacing effect. This is one of the most evidence-based strategies that we have within our learning toolbox, but it is one of the most underutilized learning strategies as well within higher education or anywhere education happens or learning happens. It doesn't matter where you're at. It's one of the most underutilized strategies that we have. And that's kind of funny because it's one of the most evidence-based practices that we have in our toolbox. And if you think about it for a second, distributed practice in a nutshell just means you distribute your practice for the content over a period of time. So you don't spend any more time studying, but you get at least double the effect than if you were to cram. And we'll go over the details in a minute, but at a very rudimentary level, it makes a lot of sense because think about it. People always compare the mind to a muscle, which the mind really isn't a muscle, but we make that comparison a lot. So think about it. If you were going to do a cram session for 8 hours, you're just going to cram the night before a test for 8 hours. And think about that. If you were going to go to the gym and you worked out for 8 hours, that would not do you any good. That would do you more harm than good, most likely. You have to go multiple times. You have to be consistent for your muscles to grow. So the same way with learning and your ability to recall information and use that information in a really unique way, you want to be able to space your practice or do it over multiple times. So think about it as well. If you don't have a healthy diet, but you want a healthy diet, are you going to go out and eat 20 pounds of greens, of broccoli, of whatever it may be to get healthy? No, you're going to make a change and you're going to do things over a time period. And that's exactly how distributed learning works as well. So let's dive in and get into the details. So what is distributed practice? Well, distributed practice is exactly what the title says. Some people call it space learning, space practice as well, but it means that you distribute the practice over a specific timeline. And what that timeline is really matters about when you need to be able to use that content. So that's what it's all about. Some people even talk about the forgetting curve and how forgetting helps us remember, and that's true as well, because spaced learning or distributed practice takes that forgetting curve into account as well. So if you've ever practice something over and over and over again, and then when it came time to use it down the road, you simply had to go relearn it. I know I had to do that quite often on the job. I thought I had everything down pat when I was in a technical school, but when I went into the job and had to perform it, say 3-4 months later, I couldn't remember because I was using massed practice instead of spaced learning or distributed practice to really get the content to stick, because massed practice doesn't really get the content to stick. Distributed practice is what gets the content to stick, so you can then later recall it and use it in a meaningful way. So if you ever had a student, or if you ever yourself gone from one class, say Psychology 101, to the next class and forgot everything that was in there, weren't able to use it. Maybe you didn't completely or wholly forget it, but you couldn't really use it to the extent that they wanted you to use it within that next class. That's probably because you use some type of massed practice or mass learning rather than distributed practice. So we're going to dive in and look at the history real quick, then we're going to look at how instructional designers can utilize this strategy within what they design, within the learning environments that they design, so they can create high-performing learning environments. We're going to dive into some key figures for distributed practice. Hermann Ebbinghaus is the father of distributed learning, and he used nonsense words and distributed the practice to see how he could remember, how well he could remember these nonsense words. And then came along Arthur Yost. And Arthur Yost has actually a law named, utilizes his name, but it's attributed to Ebbinghaus. So Arthur Yost and Yost's law basically states, if two memories are equally strong, the older memory is more resistant to forgetting. So that's kind of important, and that brings us to our first rule. And our first rule for us as designers and instructors is expand the time between study sessions. So if I learn something on day 0, then day 1, I'm going to study it. Then I'm not going to study it again on day 2. I'm going to wait till maybe day 3 or 4. It really depends on that point when you need to remember that content, or when you need to be able to use that content in a meaningful way, if it's work, anything like that. So that is the first rule. Expand the time between the study sessions or the learning sessions for that content. And now the next person we're going to chat through, that next two actually are Piotr Wozniak, not to be confused with Woz, the co-founder of Apple. Piotr Wozniak came up with SuperMemo. What is SuperMemo? Well, SuperMemo was basically an algorithm that optimizes the time between study periods, believe it or not. So the algorithm that defines the time between study periods. So SuperMemo, you can still get it now. It's an app. You could probably find it in the Google Play Store or the Apple Store. You just type in SuperMemo and you can come up and get it, and it spaces everything out according to Wozniak's algorithm, and it gives you basically flashcards to study from. So flashcards are kind of big here. Both Ebbinghaus, Yoast, Wozniak utilize flashcards quite a bit, which brings us to rule number 2, which is utilize a learning method that is effective for you. So if flashcards are effective, use it. If quizzing is effective for you, use it. The only thing that really isn't effective is rereading. Rereading is probably the worst thing you could do. So use flashcards, test yourself, do it whatever way that is meaningful for you, that really sinks you in, so you keep doing those repetitions as they become more and more spaced out until that time that you actually need it, whether it's at work or for an exam test, something like that. And we've learned the approximate values of how we're going to expand those time distances in between study sessions, and that came from a huge longitudinal study, I believe it was 8 years, that was completed by Harry Barrick, and he's completed the Barrick study, which looked for 8 years on the retention of in this case, it was Spanish. So he did a whole study with his family, believe it or not. Talk about some boring conversations around the dinner table there. But he did this whole study where different people were learning different languages, particularly 3 were learning Spanish. 1, I believe it was German. Don't quote me on that. But he really nailed down these times when, or I should say really nailed down the times in between the study sessions that are optimal. So remember, so now we have 2 points that we can go to. We can go to Wozniak's algorithm to figure it out, or we could use Barrick's longitudinal study. And here next, I want to give you some kind of baseline features of how to do this yourself. And remember, even though we're giving out rules, like we have rule 1 and rule 2, if you remember, rule 1 is expand the time between study sessions, and rule 2 is utilize something that's meaningful for you within those study sessions. I personally like quizzing. I like to quiz myself, and that keeps me moving along. So I'll have a question, see if I can answer it, whether it's multiple choice or really sort of essay sort of thing. And then I'll just relook and restudy what I need to be on top of that particular piece of content. So that works really well for me. You probably have something that works just as good for you or even better. So now let's dive in and take a look at how do we define those spaces in between study times. And that leads us to rule number 3, where it's really dependent on when you're going to use the content. And that is for work, and that is also for studies and education as well. And to really define our time intervals, Weishart and Pashler led a team from University of California, San Diego, and they really defined the times that you need to give those. Remember how we talked about the times need to be expanding. They have to expand more in between study sessions. They've really defined that. Here's some basic learning strategies to help you define when to study and how to expand the time between study sessions. And remember, the key is, when will you be using this knowledge? When do you need it by? When are you going to perform this task? And if you're going to perform this task, let's say in a month, then guess what? You're not going to jump right back in on day one and study again. You're going to move off to about a week. Let's say you have about 2 months until this big exam or this big thing that you're doing on the job. You're going to, instead of being an apprentice, you're trying to get your journeyman certificate or whatever it may be, and it's 2 months down the road. You're not going to start on that initial 2 months right away and start on the first day, then the third day, then the seventh day. Wait about a week and then map out when you're going to study. So if you had a total of 9 hours of study time or 16 hours of study time that you could give to this, take that and map it out with your first interval being at 1 week for those 2 months, and go for maybe, instead of that 7 days of that week, go 10 days between the next one, and then go 13 days between the next one. So that's an easy way to kind of map it out. So remember, what helps you learn the best are the learning strategies. So define the learning strategy and the time distance between study sessions. So that was for 2 months. So let's say you needed to learn something. You were going for your journeyman test in 3 months. What should we do to be able to learn the best? Well, on this one, remember when it was just 2 months, we waited for that first week. This one, start the second week and then expand your intervals from there. So define the time frame you're going to study. So the number of hours you're going to dedicate to studying, and then distribute them over that timeline. So if we have a month, we're going to start. If we have 2 months, we're going to start at a week. If we have 3 months, we'll start at 2 weeks. And then if we have, let's say, 6 months, start at 3 weeks and then expand those intervals between study sessions. Now, what if you have a year where you're going to need this? So you're going to take your journeyman test in a year. What study parameters should I use? Well, start with a month and just slowly work it out. Expand those study sessions, the time in between those study sessions, and define how much time you're going to give to those study sessions on each one. And then add in content as well. So all the new content you're getting, feel free to add that in as well and just distribute that out with your learning. And then when you come to that year point where you're taking your journeyman level test, guess what? You're not going to be stressed out. You're not going to be cramming. It's all going to be there because it's stuck. You can't get rid of it. Remember, those older memories are more resistant to forgetting. So you've practiced them over and over and over, and you've really cemented them in. So instead of going to the gym and working out for 10 hours, you went to the gym over a period of a year at specific intervals, and you got in shape. You ate the right foods for that whole year. You're getting healthy. You are healthy. So that is what you want with your mind. So think of your mind like a tool that you need to utilize in its best way. So it's really, if you look and compare cramming and distributed practice gives you between 50 to 100% greater retention of whatever the knowledge is, whatever the skill is. You have a huge amount of retention more. So why would we even cram? Well, you may want to cram because you don't really care about the topic. You just want to get through it. It's a subject that you just have to get through. So maybe that's what you want to do. Perfectly acceptable. Cramming works for something like that. But if it's a topic that you actually need, cramming is not beneficial at all. Distributed learning is what helps, because that helps that learning become sticky. So you're going to pass that journeyman test in, a year, 12 months. You're not going to be able to cram for something that's that comprehensive. You need to space out that learning or distribute that practice along the road so you can be successful. And another thing about cramming, when you cram, not only do you not remember, you forget quite a bit later on down the road, but when you use distributed practice, you're actually remembering it in a way where you can solve complex issues creatively with that content that you have. So that is a huge deal to be able to do. So let's dive in and see how we can do this as an instructor or instructional designer within our courses to bake that right in. So now that we know everything there is to about distributed learning, not really, you're probably going to want to dive in and take a deeper dive and read more about Ebbinghaus, Yost, Wozniak, and the Barak study as well. Those are just hugely interesting. But as an ID or an instructor, what can we do within our class to utilize distributed learning? Well, if you're teaching online, hybrid, or face-to-face in person, there are very simple practices that we can build right in. I'm going to focus in on online learning. So this is really simple to do as a designer if you're building online courses. And one way you can do that is, Yoast, Ebbinghaus, Wozniak, they loved flashcards. So you can use flashcards. You can put that right in your LMS. You could use quizzes. You could use any other tool that you prefer. And how I would personally go about it, how I do go about it when designing my courses is the first week, initial week 1, there's nothing to look back on. But week 2, Monday of week 2, I give an activity. What is the activity? Well, it's the content from week 1 because I'm designing 8 or 16 week courses, right? So if it's 16 weeks, I'm going to start with that initial week 1. But in week 3, I'll have something on Monday that'll go right back to week 2, connect back to week 2, and I'll also have something in the middle of the week that's going to connect back to week 1. And then after that, I'm going to start mixing up the content and stretching it out throughout the different weeks. And that makes it hugely interesting. What I do is I keep the focus on, so if we learn something in week 4, and I'm going to touch on it with an activity in week 5, I'm going to focus on that, but I'm also going to interleave. So that's another thing that we're going to talk about later, the content from week 1 or week 2, right? So now I have that spacing effect where we're really moving it along and I'm spacing out even longer between the intervals that I'm studying the content. So that's the important piece. You have to gauge where you're going to put in the weeks the content. So week 1, I'm going to start off in week 2. Then I might even wait until week 4 to put more content in about week 1. But week 2's content, I'm going to hit week 3. And then week 3's content, I'm going to hit week 2. And I'm also, guess what? I'm also going to tie in at later some stuff from week 1. So always think about how you're going to distribute that practice throughout the entire process, throughout your 16 weeks. I use a simple spreadsheet to do that. There's a whole lot of tools out there that can make it very simple for you to do, but I just have a spreadsheet and I say, okay, this was the content this week. When am I going to do it over the next 16 weeks? And that way, even if they're not building up to a final exam that's comprehensive, guess what? We're making that learning stick. And when we make that learning stick, they're able to use that content to creatively solve complex problems. And when our students can creatively solve complex problems with the knowledge that they've gained within class, that learning has just become sticky. We have created the high-performing learning environment, and that's what we want to do. So really use distributed practice to create that high-performing learning environment. And let me know down below in the comments what you do, because I imagine you do something like that already, or if you've been experimenting with this, let me know what you're doing so we can share this out with everybody.